Hello and welcome to Dialogue. German farmers blocked streets in several major cities this month to protest the abolition of agricultural subsidies as the German government attempts to plug loopholes in its finances. What has thwarted Europe's largest economy? Will that also impact its foreign policies? Meanwhile, Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz recently voiced concern over the rise of the far right in his country, which has triggered nationwide counter-rallies. What has fueled the rapid growth of extreme right ideology in Germany? This is our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Helga Zepp-LaRouche, founder and president of the Schiller Institute, Professor Iain Begg from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Fraser Cameron, senior advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. Welcome to Dialogue. So, Iain, I will start with you. There's a talk of the comeback, the phrase, the sick man of Europe, talking about the German economy or stagnation. What do you think are the major problems facing the biggest European economy right now?
It's a long list. The first is that Germany was highly dependent on imported gas coming from Russia, and its transition away from that has raised the cost of energy for many German producers, particularly of heavy manufacturing. Second, German public finances are in difficulty. Germany has had over the previous decade a quite strong record in its public finances of reducing its public debt. But after COVID and the arrival of the new government, that has gone into difficulty because the growth in the economy has slowed, partly as a result of the energy crisis, and that has made it far more difficult to meet the legal requirements, what's known in German as the black zero, the schwarze Null, which is to have no deficit in the public finances as a way of bringing down debt. And to repair that, you've seen the efforts by the government to do things like try to reduce agricultural subsidies, particularly for the cost of fuel. Result, the German farming interests blockading the center of Berlin to object to this. So it's a combination of things which is going wrong at the wrong time. Now, to call Germany the sick man of Europe again is maybe an exaggeration. Germany is going through a significant energy transition, and that's at the root of all the problems.
Well, Fraser, I wonder, how do you characterize the problem, the challenges, both short-term and probably long-term? Of course, we know that Germany is not the only European country suffering from, say, the decoupling from Russia because of the Ukraine issue there. And of course, it has seems like some commonality with other countries in terms of the challenges, but also it has some probably unique challenges unique to this country.
Well, in addition to what Iain said there, I would add that, the global situation has not been favorable to Germany. I mean, the downside in the global economy in general, China in particular, Germany was still is the biggest exporter to China. And so the downturn in China has affected the German economy as well. Plus, I think there's been a policy dispute running through this government. It's three very disparate parties, the Social Democrats, the Greens with their agenda, which they've had to sort of revise quite dramatically, and the more liberal FDP party. So holding that coalition together has been very difficult for Chancellor Scholz. But I also agree with Iain's summation at the end. I mean, to describe Germany as the sick man of Europe is an exaggeration. German economy has always been very strong, and I'm pretty confident it will weather the current difficulties and emerge stronger in the medium term.
Yeah, Fraser, a follow-up. What is the government doing, to respond or to meet those challenges? For example, the energy issue. I think it's like other European countries, you do see the prices are coming down in terms of fuel, and people also talk about other the lack of investment in infrastructure or the high corporate tax rates, etc., or digital infrastructure. What is the government doing, to meet probably the need or expectations of the people?
They're having to revise their policies, particularly on climate change. I mean, this was the talisman policy of the Greens, but accepted by the whole government. and accelerated by the Russian crisis. But the reality is, given the cost of living, the increase in fuel for farmers, etc., they've had to roll back. So they're talking now of prolonging the life of the nuclear industry, and they're talking about sort of adjusting climate change goals, to meet the sort of requirements of farmers and others, and also the domestic heating costs. So I think it's a very sort of pragmatic turn of events in the coalition, recognizing that the goals which they all signed up to are simply not feasible in the short to medium term. So they haven't given them up. They've simply said it's going to take a longer time to achieve this transition. In addition, of course, they have to do more to attract foreign investment, and the current climate in Germany with the rise of the far right is worrying, because the head of the Deutsche Bank yesterday just gave a warning saying that the rise of the far right was not conducive to foreign investment. So this is a worry as well.
Speak of foreign investment, so Iain, of course, there's, or at least, there was probably the talk of deindustrialization because of the high price energies and also, attractive policies, for example, in North America for investment in the renewable energy sector. So how does Germany, fare in that sector?
But Germany is in difficulty partly because of the very strong policy implemented in the US under the heading of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a ridiculous heading, which really means subsidies for green industries. And that's attracting capital across to the other side of the Atlantic. Germany is not alone in suffering from it, but because Germany has a relatively bigger and more advanced manufacturing sector, if a company decides, I will go to South Carolina rather than Bavaria, then that makes a big impact on Germany, bigger impact on other countries which are relatively smaller manufacturing sectors. In addition, I think it's fair to say that Germany has been rather slow on the digital transition. It's well known that Germany has a weak infrastructure in digital, that it's been slow to develop some of the new policies, and there it's facing competition from Central and Eastern Europe. If you take the example of Estonia, a very small country, but Estonia has very advanced digitalization, which Germany has failed to catch up with. So it's this kind of drip process of things being taken away from Germany it's used to, like exports to China, like its strength of its small and medium-sized companies known as the Mittelstand, and things that Germany relied on in the past, all being challenged simultaneously.
Well, the slow progress in terms of a digital economy, Iain, what are the factors, leading to the slow probably move, from the government or from the society in terms of achieving digitalization, digital infrastructure?
I would identify two. One is a degree of complacency. We're all right in Germany from, say, 5 or 10 years ago, and we don't need to be making a big effort to do this. And suddenly it catches up with you because the complacency is shattered when you realize competitors are doing different things. But Germany is also suffering from what I said at the beginning. The effect of this transition to a new energy regime has been very rapid. And that has been undermining confidence in investing in Germany, which means that if you look at some of the bigger companies, they're not rushing to invest in Germany. And you see this in the digital field, where not just Germany, but the whole of Europe lags in its numbers of digital-based companies. In the top 20 digital companies, you don't see any European companies. And even the biggest of the German ones, SAP and Deutsche Telekom, are in the third decile of these rankings.
Mm-hmm. Well, Helga, welcome to join us. If you look at the protests, of course, it's not only the German farmers, but also the railway staff, lorry drivers. They also have their own protest against the government policies, this and that. What is if there's anything common, what is the thing, what is the factor that to make them unhappy? I mean, they choose to go to the streets to protest the government?
Hello?
Hello, Helga? Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Can you hear me?
Oh, it seems
Can you
there's a
please
tech issue. Let me turn to Fraser. Fraser, it's like it seems that unhappiness, it comes from not only the one sector, for example, farmers. That's understandable because they are concerned with the reduction of their subsidies, so they are not happy. What about these lorry drivers, railway workers for there?
Well, it's mainly fuel costs. I mean, fuel costs have gone up for truckers as well as farmers. And in addition, the farmers are suffering from what they consider cheap imports from Ukraine, which has also led to protests in Poland and elsewhere. I mean, this is a broader program. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen widespread demonstrations of farmers in France blocking Paris, in Belgium, Spain, other countries. And of course, it's having knock-on consequences because President Macron has now written to President von der Leyen saying, look, we can't really go ahead with this big trade deal with South America, with Mercosur. You've got to stop it because politically it's so difficult for me. So the internal fuel cost rises, which of various causes, but particularly, moving away from Russia, have had this knock-on effect on agriculture, on other sectors of the economy, leading to higher inflation. And of course, that's always a real problem for German governments. They do not want to see a return to any era of high inflation.
Fraser, speak of the inflation. The news is, from the central bank is that, it seems like they are able, or it's under control. People are even talking about, reducing, decrease the interest rates. So can we say it's not that a big a threat anymore to German economy as well as to the European countries there?
Iain?
Yeah, inflation is creeping downwards, but the European Central Bank, having been late to raise interest rates to counter inflation, is also hesitating about reducing interest rates until they're certain that inflation is under control. And the most important consequence of this is that if you look at several European economies, they're flatlining. There's all kinds of discussion about whether Germany is or is not in recession, but it's a false discussion because the simple fact is German growth is zero. It may be zero minus a tenth of a percentage point, or maybe plus a tenth of a percentage point. But that means that because the cost of living is still rising, German workers and German households are suffering a reduction in real spending power because of this effect of higher energy prices. And they don't benefit from high energy prices. Others do. Germany imports, for example, electricity from France, who generate it through nuclear. French producers win, German consumers lose. And it's this sense across many sectors of my standard of living is being reduced that is provoking many of these protests, whether it's truck drivers, farmers, or others.
So it's in a sense, it's a cost of living crisis. We talked about in some European countries. Is that a continuation of that, or is it getting worse? Is it getting better?
Well, it's going to depend on the trend of wages. The European Central Bank will be looking at what's happening with wages, and if it sees wages starting to accelerate above the rate of inflation, the central bank will be worried that entrenches inflation by having a second round effect. So that's why we're sort of waiting to see whether the central bank, let's not forget the central bank is for the whole of the Eurozone, it's not just for Germany, and it sets its rates based on overall Eurozone effects, not just German inflation. And it may be that Germany, a country which has traditionally had lower inflation than others, will be more adversely affected by the central bank decisions than a country with high inflation.
Mm-hmm. Well, Fraser, earlier you mentioned about the Ukraine, factor. Of course, there are concerns about imports of agricultural products from Ukraine, especially in the Eastern European countries. But also, the protesters, German farmers, they also expressed the concern of you are spending money, to support Ukraine. I mean, we know the crisis will continue, and we don't see the end of it yet. So how big a factor is that? People say, the Ukraine crisis is what would you call it, like a fatigue of supporting Ukraine there?
It's not too difficult for Germany. I mean, all the major political parties are in favor of continued support for Ukraine. And today, Chancellor Scholz and a number of other European leaders published a letter in the Financial Times saying we must continue this support, and President Macron made the same thing in a speech yesterday in Stockholm. So politically, the will to go on to support Ukraine is there. Amongst the population, there is a certain fatigue on both sides of the Atlantic, in fact, and this is a factor that politicians have to take into account. But ultimately, Germany and others know that there is no alternative but to support Ukraine in its struggle against Russia, because allowing Russia to sort of win in Ukraine, take over, a chunk of a sovereign country is simply unacceptable. So I think for the moment, politically and economically, Germany and others will find the resources, despite the opposition of some countries like Hungary, to ensure there is adequate support for Ukraine. But it will not be easy.
Would not be easy. Okay, that's, let's say, a factor from outside. It seems the challenges or problems are mostly domestic, oriented. Speak of that, Fraser, if you look at this, there's a survey, more than halfway through its 4-year term. The survey found out 82% of German voters are less than happy or not at all happy with the performance of the Scholz government and the divided coalition, with the Greens and also neoliberal FDP. What are they not happy with?
Well, they're not happy, obviously, with the decline in their standard of living. But this is not just affecting Germany. I would say probably in every country in Europe, there's not a positive rating for the government, because all the governments are struggling to deal with the sort of impact of the global issues which we mentioned earlier. And of course, trying to ensure your voters appreciate that there are many issues that the government can't control. And it's a very difficult message to get across. They have been used for many years to see the standard of living steadily increase. And when this comes to a stop or even reverses, then obviously they take it out on the government and they don't listen very much to any mitigating factors. So politically, it's a very difficult situation for practically all governments in Europe.
Iain, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, there's an additional factor in Germany, which is you're quoting an aggregate poll, but I think you also have to recognize there are regional differences in Germany. And Germany being a federal state with very strong regional, or what we call land-level governments, you can see big differences. And the support for the right-wing insurgent party called Alternative for Germany, Alternative for Deutschland, is above all in the old states of what used to be East Germany. But you see other new parties coming in who are trying to exploit this unhappiness with the core government. And don't forget, as we said earlier, the core government is a very strange coalition. It's known as the traffic light because it has colours representing very different segments of the German political system. So this regional dimension is important in Germany. And it also ties in with a much longer term effect on Germany, which is that of aging of the population. Germany is one of the more rapidly aging populations in Europe. That implies future public expenditure to service that older population at the same time as Germany has promised to try to increase its share of GDP spent on defense, taking it from just over 1% to 2%. So all of these things come together to make the public finance puzzle that more difficult for Germany to deal with.
Well, now we have Helga on the line. Helga, so we see the rise of AfD, the right-wing party. The Chancellor Scholz expressed a concern about that. How big a challenge is that, and how big a threat, let's say, people are feeling from the rise of this right-wing ideology?
Well, it's mixed, because obviously within the AfD, there are some very problematic people in it who are even fascist. You can call them fascist by a court decision. But the majority of the people voting for the AfD do that because of a general dissatisfaction with the government policy, that the exit from nuclear energy left Germany without secure energy supplies, that money is given for weapons to Ukraine and now to Israel, which is lacking for infrastructure, schools, health system. So there is a variety of reasons why people are voting for the AfD. But I would like to point out one thing which I think is extremely important, especially for people abroad, to recognize that, the real protest against the government policy is what the farmers have demonstrated in the last weeks, with 100,000 tractors in all over Germany blocking highways, expressing their moral dissatisfaction that they just want the money which allows them to produce food for the entire population. They're not trying to make riches like speculators. They're just providing nourishment for the entire population. So it's a very legitimate demand. Now, this is mixed, and this is very difficult for people abroad to understand. But there was this so-called secret meeting in Potsdam where supposedly some AfD and other right-wing people were planning what was called by the media deportation of migrants. This was completely, I think this is really a very ominous operation, because the journalists received apparently that from the internal secret service of Germany and then kept it quiet for 6 weeks. And only after the farmers had this huge demonstration with 100,000 tractors on Monday and then the whole week, and then culminating in a big demonstration in Berlin 1 week later, and it's still going on. Mm-hmm. Only 2 days later, that story about this so-called right-wing plot was published by the mainstream media, and the mainstream media are now publishing in great detail the place of these so-called anti-right demonstrations, so that everybody. There are now more and more people are suspecting that this is an effort by the government to detract from the rightful protest of the farmers. And even the farmers are now saying that themselves. And I think this is rather than changing the policy, which is also one has to be aware of the fact that this is not even the prices made by the government or even the EU Commission. These are prices made by the international cartels. Mm-hmm. And okay. The farmers.
I want to, Fraser, your response, is it a real crisis, a real challenge in the rise of the, AfD, for example, or we are seeing a real threat from the extreme right ideology?
Well, it is a threat, but I wouldn't exaggerate it. I mean, there was huge, massive counter demonstrations in Berlin and other cities across Germany over the last week. So I think the AfD support is regional, as Iain suggested. And of course, the overall in Europe, you see a steady rise of the far right, but they're not in the process of taking over in the near future any government across Europe. So I think we have to see it in perspective. It's a worry. The reasons for it are well known because of the economic difficulties. But I think, politicians are aware of the threat and are taking measures to counter it.
Mm-hmm. In a related story, of course, is Germany's nominal GDP is reportedly surpassing that of Japan in 2023. How is that happening? Tell us.
Well, Japan has been through 3 decades of relatively low growth, and is therefore not surprising that its GDP tends to fall vis-a-vis other countries. Japan, too, is a country facing a big demographic impact, where the population of Japan is forecast to fall by tens of millions over the next 30 or 40 years. So it's not unusual. But the big question I put to you is, so what? Who cares what nominal GDP is? Because that's just a figure reflecting both exchange rates and other things. And as you may know, the yen is at pretty well an all-time low at the moment because of the devaluation it's seen over the last few quarters. Is great for me because I'm going to Japan next month, so I'll be able to spend for it very freely. So nominal GDP doesn't tell you all that much. What you should really concentrate on is the disposable income and spending power of the populations. And there, Japan, I think you'll find, is still reasonably comfortable despite its decades of low growth.
Well, let's take a look at the external, possible or potential external impact. Iain, for example, there's talk of like de-risking. There are policies, to screen investment from China or investment to China or export to China. Given these challenges in Germany and other European countries, do you think economic challenge will somehow prompt the German government or the EU to recalibrate its relationship with China or its China policy?
Well, it's not just China, it's also with the US because of the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act. I think both China and the US have very substantial policies to try to anticipate the new industries that they want for the future and the new bases for their economy, new economic models almost. At European level, it's very hard to get agreement on it. And as we will see later this week when the European Council meets, which is the heads of state, what's likely to happen is that they'll have another dispute about changing the amount of money they want to invest in new technologies. They've already sliced it below the proposals that were first put forward, and that's going to be another kind of horse trading going on among countries. Do I get a bit? Do you get a bit? And the collective effect is that the European response to the, I won't call it threat, I'll call it the challenge from China or the US is incoherent. And that affects Germany just as it does other countries of the European Union.
Yeah, challenges from outside. So Fraser, if you take a look, of course, this is an election year for the U.S. and there, at least so far, it appears there's a real prospect for Donald Trump to come back to the White House. I mean, how is that viewed or taken in Germany or in the European in general?
Well, the vast majority of politicians obviously do not want to see Trump back in the White House. I mean, he does have some support in Europe. I mean, Orban is a strong supporter. He's also supporting Italy and some other countries. But, the American voters have to decide, and Europe will have to live with it. I mean, in some areas, for example, Trump saying to Europe, you have to do more in terms of your own defense, he was quite right. And this is something that Democrats have been saying as well. So we have to accept the outcome. It will be more difficult, I think, for Europe to work with Trump, but that's unfortunately the price of democracy, so we'll have to see.
Will that, let's say, Trump recently talked about, NATO, like US is basically doing the last year in terms of supporting NATO financially, but they are not getting much out of NATO. So will a second term of Trump somehow make Germany, for example, more burdensome in terms of supporting NATO, in terms of supporting Ukraine?
Well, Germany has also started its so-called Zeitenwende, a real change in outlook by trying to increase its defense expenditure. I mean, that's the aim, is to reach the 2% level, which will be difficult. But I think, there is no alternative but for the Europeans as a whole to do much more, regardless of who is in the White House, because I think, that is going to be a continuing trend here. But I think the idea that Trump would somehow pull US out of NATO, that's not going to happen because Congress has passed a law saying this would need congressional approval, which is not going to happen because there's no majority in the Congress or the Senate for this to happen. So you can expect Trump to be more tougher on Europe as he was before, but it's only a question of degree vis-a-vis what would be happening anyway, regardless of who's in the White House.
A question of degree.
I think you would say as well that it's the trade question where Trump's threatening all these new tariffs more than the NATO question that worries.
I agree.
Yeah, and trade, of course, again, more disputes over there. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.